Everyone knows American field hospitals were in France, but almost no one knows what happened inside them. There were rules that never made it into any treaty, policies that were never signed, never ratified, never printed in the Geneva Convention or the Hague Agreements. And yet, they were followed, quietly, consistently. Across hundreds of field hospitals and aid stations spread across the fields and forests of Western Europe, rules that determined who got treated first, who waited, and in some cases, who survived. And when you dig into what those rules actually were, the story that comes out is not the one you learned in school. If you've never heard this story before, you're not alone. Most people haven't. It was buried under the noise of the bigger narrative, the landings, the campaigns, the battles, but it matters. It matters because it tells you something true about how armies actually work, about how medicine and military strategy were woven together in ways that most history books don't touch, about the decisions made in the mud and the blood and the half-light of a canvas tent that shaped not just the battle in front of them, but the entire relationship between the American military and the French people they had come to liberate. Stick with this, because this is one of those stories where the details change everything, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here, the ones that fell through the cracks of the official record. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Let's start with what the rules actually said, not what people assume they said. When American forces landed in France beginning in June of 1944, they did not arrive with a single unified medical doctrine that covered civilian care. The Geneva Conventions, specifically the 1929 iteration that governed much of World War II, dealt with the treatment of wounded soldiers and prisoners of war. It gave protections to medical personnel. It defined what a protected medical facility looked like, but it said very little about how military hospitals should handle civilian casualties in an active combat zone. That gap, that silence in the official documents, is where this story lives. What actually governed American field hospital behavior in France was a combination of things: standing orders from theater command, informal agreements between American commanders and French civil authorities, the medical department's own doctrine, which had been evolving through North Africa, Sicily, and Italy before France, and something harder to quantify but no less real, the political and social reality on the ground, which shaped every decision made by every medical officer who set up a tent in a French village. To understand why civilians came before German prisoners of war in the triage hierarchy at many American field installations, you have to understand what triage actually meant in 1944. And you have to understand what it meant to be operating not just as a military force, but as a liberating army in a country whose civilian infrastructure had been systematically destroyed. Triage, as the American military used it, was not simply about treating the most seriously wounded first. That is a common misconception. Military triage in World War II was specifically designed around one principle: return the maximum number of soldiers to fighting effectiveness in the minimum amount of time. That sounds cold, but in practice, it meant that soldiers with minor wounds were often treated before soldiers with catastrophic injuries. Because the soldier who could be patched up and sent back to his unit in 48 hours was a higher military priority than the soldier who would need months of care regardless of treatment. This doctrine was practical. It was also, in some ways, ruthless. And it had been developed specifically for military patients. It did not account for civilians. It did not account for the reality of fighting through towns and villages full of people who had nowhere to go. It did not account for a liberated France. Here is where the story gets complicated. And here is where the decisions made by American medical officers begin to diverge from what you might expect. When the first American forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches in the summer of 1944, they moved through a landscape that had been the target of intense Allied bombardment for months. The pre-invasion bombing campaign had been extraordinarily destructive to French infrastructure: bridges, rail lines, roads, and yes, hospitals. French civilian medical facilities across Normandy had been damaged or destroyed. The ones that remained were overwhelmed. And now there were fresh civilian casualties being added every hour, people caught in the crossfire of the advance, people whose homes had been destroyed, people who had been trapped between the German defenses and the Allied push. The French population was, in the bluntest possible terms, in the way. Not by choice. Not by any fault of their own. But the simple geography of the campaign meant that the areas where fighting was happening were also areas where French civilians lived. And when a French farmer's child was caught in a mortar blast, or when a French grandmother's house collapsed from a shell hit, there was no French hospital to take them to. There was only the American Field Hospital 2 kilometers up the road. American medical officers faced a choice that no treaty had prepared them for, and the choice they made, again and again, across hundreds of individual situations, was to treat the civilians. Not because the rules required it, because the rules didn't say anything, but because not treating them would have been a catastrophe of a different kind. To understand the full weight of that, you have to understand the political dimension of the American presence in France. And this part of the story is something that does not get enough attention. The American military did not arrive in France as a neutral party. They arrived as liberators. That word, liberators, carried enormous weight. It was not just a slogan, it was a strategic framework. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which everyone knew as SHAEF, under Eisenhower, was acutely aware that the success of the campaign depended not just on military operations, but on French cooperation and French goodwill. The relationship between American forces and the French civilian population was considered a strategic asset, a real, tangible military asset, not a sentiment, not a nicety, a resource that could be cultivated or squandered depending on how American forces behaved. SHAEF issued guidance that was broadly understood across the command structure. The liberation of France required the French people to see Americans as partners, not occupiers. The distinction mattered enormously. The Germans had been occupiers. They had requisitioned food, imposed curfews, executed resistors, and treated the French population with contempt or indifference depending on the day. Americans were supposed to be different. Were supposed to be demonstrably, visibly, undeniably different. That meant behavior in villages and towns. It meant how soldiers interacted with French families. It meant how American military justice dealt with crimes against French civilians. And it meant, critically, what happened when French civilians showed up at the gate of an American medical facility bleeding and terrified and with no other place to go. There is a memo, remarkable in its directness, that circulated among American medical officers in France in the summer of 1944. It did not come from Geneva. It did not come from the War Department. It came from the theater, and it essentially said this: the treatment or refusal of treatment of French civilian casualties by American medical units has direct implications for the conduct of the campaign. Medical officers were not just making medical decisions. They were making decisions that affected whether French civil authorities cooperated with American forces, whether the French population provided intelligence, hid Allied personnel, or turned hostile. The memo was careful not to be explicit about triage prioritization, but its message was unmistakable. French civilians matter strategically. Treat them accordingly. This is the context in which the informal rule developed. French civilians, under many circumstances, would be treated before German prisoners of war. Not in any treaty, not in any signed directive that you can find in a single archive, but practiced, understood, and in many cases explicitly ordered at the unit level. Now let's talk about what the Geneva Convention actually said about German prisoners of war, because this is where the story gets morally complex, and where the decisions made by American medical officers required real moral seriousness. The 1929 Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War was clear on one point. Prisoners of war were entitled to medical care equivalent to that provided to the forces of the capturing power. That is the language. Equivalent. Not lesser. Not after everyone else. Equivalent. A German soldier who was captured and wounded was legally entitled, under the convention that the United States had signed, to the same quality of medical treatment as an American soldier. What the convention did not spell out was triage order within a mass casualty situation. It did not say that a German prisoner with a broken arm had to be treated before a French civilian with a shrapnel wound to the abdomen. It established a standard of care, not a queue position. And this is the distinction that American medical officers used, in practice and in conscience, to navigate an impossible situation. They were not denying German prisoners care. They were not letting them die in a corner while treating everyone else. They were making triage decisions in which the civilian population of France occupied a position that was, in practice, often higher in the queue than German prisoners of war. The justification ran along several lines. Let's go through them, because each one reveals something different about how the American military actually thought. The first justification was strategic, and it was the most frankly stated. German prisoners of war were captured. They were accounted for. They were going to be evacuated to rear area prisoner of war camps where they would receive treatment. They were in the system. A French civilian woman hit by shrapnel in the street outside the hospital had nowhere else to go and no system to fall into. If she was not treated now, she might die before help arrived from any other source. The German prisoner had time. She did not. This was not about valuing French lives more than German lives in some abstract moral sense. It was about resource allocation in a situation where one group had alternatives and one group had none. The second justification was medical, and it overlapped with the strategic one but had its own logic. Field hospitals in forward areas were not equipped to handle indefinite holding of prisoners requiring long-term care. Their job was stabilization and rapid evacuation. German prisoners who could be stabilized and moved were moved. French civilians who could not be moved, because there was nowhere safe to move them to, required more intensive immediate care. The medical logic reinforced the strategic logic. The third justification was political, and it was the one that lived most uncomfortably alongside the laws of war. The political reality was that American forces needed French cooperation to operate. Visibly abandoning wounded French civilians in favor of German prisoners would have had consequences that were, in the assessment of American commanders, militarily unacceptable. This justification made some medical officers deeply uneasy, because it was, at its core, using civilian treatment as a political tool. But in the context of a liberation campaign, where civilian cooperation was not just helpful but operationally necessary, the argument had weight that was difficult to dismiss. Let's talk now about how this actually worked on the ground, because doctrine and practice are always different, and the ground-level reality of American field hospitals in France was one of constant improvisation, constant pressure, and constant moral negotiation. American field hospitals in World War II came in several forms. The most forward element was the aid station, typically run by a battalion surgeon with a small team, capable of little more than stopping bleeding, starting intravenous fluids, and preparing casualties for evacuation. Behind them came the collecting companies, then the clearing companies, then the field hospitals themselves, which were the first installations capable of serious surgical intervention. Behind them were the evacuation hospitals, larger, more permanent, capable of longer-term care. And behind them, the general hospitals, typically in larger French towns or cities, which handled the most complex cases and the longest recoveries. This system was designed for military patients. It was designed to process wounded American soldiers quickly, efficiently, and with the goal of returning as many as possible to duty or evacuating the rest to England or the United States. It was not designed for a civilian population that was simultaneously being liberated and being caught in the crossfire of the liberation. But that is what it got, and the system adapted, imperfectly and under pressure, but it adapted. At clearing companies and field hospitals, medical officers developed their own local protocols. Some of these protocols were remarkably consistent across the theater. Others varied by unit, by commander, by the specific situation each hospital found itself in. But the broad pattern held. French civilians in urgent need of care received it. German prisoners of war received care, but often after the immediate civilian need had been addressed. There were also practical complications that the formal triage doctrine had not anticipated. Language was one. American medical personnel who spoke French were invaluable not just for treating civilians, but for gathering information about what had happened, where casualties were, what the local infrastructure looked like. Units that had good French-speaking personnel, through formal Army language programs or simply through the accident of immigrant heritage, were often better equipped to handle civilian patients efficiently. Units that had no French speakers struggled more, not just linguistically, but medically, because a patient who can't communicate symptoms is a patient you cannot fully assess. The physical condition of the French civilian population was another complicating factor that American medical officers had not fully anticipated. Years of German occupation had left the French population malnourished, in many cases suffering from conditions that were not combat-related at all. TB was common. Malnutrition was widespread. Children arrived at aid stations with conditions that had nothing to do with the battle and everything to do with 4 years of German economic exploitation. Medical officers faced the question, again and again, of what their obligation was to non-combat medical need in the middle of an active combat operation. The answer, practically and in most cases, was to do what could be done quickly and then refer. The army did not have the capacity to function as the public health system for a liberated France, but the immediate humanitarian obligation was understood, and to a remarkable degree, honored. Now let's talk about the German prisoner of war population specifically, because it is important to be clear about what actually happened to them, not just in the context of this triage question, but in the broader framework of American prisoner of war handling. The United States military in France handled an enormous number of German prisoners as the campaign progressed. The Normandy campaign alone produced tens of thousands of prisoners in its first weeks. By the time American forces reached Germany itself, the numbers were in the millions. Managing this prisoner population was a logistical challenge of staggering proportions, and the medical dimension of it was a major part of that challenge. German prisoners who were wounded were treated. This is important to state clearly and without qualification. The triage prioritization that placed French civilians ahead of German prisoners in many field hospital situations did not mean German prisoners were left to die. What it meant, in practice, was that the sequence of treatment in mass casualty situations put civilian need ahead of prisoner need when the prisoner had greater access to follow-on care and the civilian did not. American medical officers who served in France have described this in memoirs and in oral histories collected after the war. The language they use is careful and honest. They were not making decisions about the worth of human lives. They were making decisions about the allocation of limited medical resources in a specific operational context, and within that context, the French civilian population occupied a position that the rules had not formally assigned to them, but that practical and political reality had made unavoidable. There is a specific category of case that came up repeatedly and that illustrates the dilemma more sharply than any generalization can. That is the case of the acute surgical emergency. A patient, whether soldier, civilian, or prisoner, who required immediate surgery to survive. In those cases, triage doctrine at its most basic level applied without modification. The person who would die without immediate intervention got the operating table. French civilian or German prisoner, the surgical emergency took precedence. What varied was everything around the edges of that emergency. The patient who needed a wound cleaned and sutured, but was not in immediate danger of dying. The prisoner who needed antibiotics and dressing changes. The civilian child who needed a splint and monitoring. In those categories, where immediate survival was not at stake, the ordering of treatment reflected the broader priority structure that had developed in the theater. And that priority structure, to be absolutely precise about it, placed American wounded first, French civilians second, and German prisoners third. Not in any formal published document, not in the Geneva Convention, not in the Hague Regulations, but in the operational reality of American medicine in France in 1944 and 1945. Let's go deeper into the historical documentation that supports this, because this is not a story that has been told through a single definitive source. It has been assembled from pieces, and understanding where those pieces come from matters. The Army Medical Department's official history, published in multiple volumes after the war, contains extensive discussion of the challenges of civilian medical care in France. It is careful in its language. It does not state baldly that German prisoners were routinely deprioritized in favor of French civilians. But it documents in detail the enormous scale of civilian medical need that American field hospitals encountered, the ways in which theater medical policy evolved to address that need, and the repeated emphasis from SHAEF on the importance of French civilian welfare to the overall campaign. The SHAEF Civil Affairs Division produced extensive documentation on the relationship between military operations and French civilian welfare. This documentation makes clear that medical treatment of civilians was considered a civil affairs function with direct military implications. Units that handled civilian medical emergencies well were viewed as contributing to the success of the liberation mission in ways that extended beyond the purely military. After-action reports from specific field hospital units contain individual case descriptions and clinical notes that, when read in aggregate, paint a consistent picture of civilian triage prioritization. These reports do not announce a policy, but the pattern in them is unmistakable once you know what to look for. Oral history collections, particularly those assembled by the Army Center of Military History and by various university archives in the decades after the war, contain direct testimony from physicians, nurses, and medical enlisted men who served in France. These testimonies are remarkably candid. Many of the individuals interviewed were reflecting on experiences that had stayed with them for decades, and they described the civilian triage question with a directness that formal documentation does not always capture. One physician, whose unit served in Normandy and then through the breakout and the pursuit across France, described the situation in terms that have stayed with historians who encountered the interview. He said that no one ever sat down and wrote an order that said, "Treat the French before the Germans." But everyone understood that if a French child was bleeding in front of your hospital and a German soldier with a lesser wound was already inside, the French child came in first. He said it was never a question anyone debated. It was just what you did. And then he added something that cuts to the heart of the story. He said, "We were there because the French had suffered enough. We weren't going to make them suffer more because of paperwork." That phrase, "because of paperwork," is telling. It reflects a specific kind of moral reasoning that military medicine in World War II had to develop for itself, because the formal framework had not kept up with the reality. The laws of war had been written in an earlier era, with certain assumptions about how wars were fought and who got caught in them. By 1944, those assumptions had been shattered. The distinction between combatant and civilian had been blurred by years of total war, occupation, bombardment, and resistance. The medical personnel who arrived in France found themselves in a situation that no conference table in Geneva had fully imagined. There is another dimension to this story that does not get nearly enough attention. That is the role of French medical personnel in shaping American practice. And this is where the history gets genuinely surprising. As American forces advanced through France, they encountered French medical personnel, doctors, nurses, and medics, who had been operating under the German occupation, and who had their own experience of wartime medicine, their own priorities, their own understanding of the situation on the ground. The relationship between American and French medical personnel varied enormously. In some areas it was formal and cooperative. In others it was tense and complicated by the politics of collaboration and resistance. But in almost every case, French medical personnel conveyed the same message to their American counterparts. The civilian population has been waiting for help for 4 years. Please don't make them wait anymore. This message was heard. In units where American and French medical personnel worked closely together, the informal prioritization of French civilians was often most pronounced. French physicians could communicate directly with patients, assess their histories, explain their needs in ways that American personnel without language skills could not. And they brought with them an understanding of what the occupation had done to French public health that gave American medical officers a context they would otherwise have lacked. There were also cases where French civil authorities, mayors, prefects, representatives of the local administration, approached American medical commanders directly and explicitly requested treatment for their civilian populations. These requests were almost always granted. Not because the law required it, but because the political and humanitarian logic was overwhelming. Now let's talk about something that the triage question opens up, but that is rarely examined directly. The question of what German prisoners of war actually thought about how they were being treated. This is not a perspective that appears often in the conventional historical record. German prisoner of war memoirs from France are not common in English. German military medicine was operating under its own pressures and its own ideological framework. And the prisoner of war experience varied so enormously depending on where you were captured, what unit you were with, what your wounds were, and what the specific American unit was that captured you, that generalizations are dangerous. But there is some documentation, and what it suggests is interesting. German prisoners who were treated by American medical personnel were, in many cases, surprised by what they received, not because they were denied treatment, but because the treatment they received was often better than what German military medicine had provided them. American medical logistics were better. American surgical techniques were more advanced in certain respects. American supplies of blood products, antibiotics, and anesthesia were more reliable than what the Wehrmacht could offer its own soldiers by 1944. Some prisoners described being treated in the same facilities as French civilians and American soldiers, sometimes in adjacent beds or on adjacent cots. The experience of being a wounded enemy in an American hospital in France was, by many accounts, not the experience of being singled out for worse care. It was the experience of being in a system that was overwhelmed and doing its best with what it had, and in which you were neither the highest nor the lowest priority. The prisoners who fared worst were those who were captured in large numbers during rapid advances, when the logistics of prisoner handling had not kept up with the speed of the campaign. In those situations, wounded prisoners sometimes waited longer than was medically ideal for treatment, not because of any policy of neglect, but because the system was simply stretched past its capacity. This happened to American wounded too. It happened to French civilians too. It was the chaos of a major modern campaign moving at a pace that the logistical infrastructure struggled to match. There is a different set of cases, however, that deserve separate treatment. Those are the cases involving German soldiers who were not wounded, but who were sick, or who claimed to be sick, and who were processed through American medical facilities in ways that required determinations of genuine medical need versus malingering or manipulation. This was a problem that American medical officers recognized and had to manage. A German prisoner who exaggerated symptoms to avoid working, to gain access to better conditions, or simply to get off his feet for a few days was a medical resource problem. Units developed their own approaches to this, ranging from thorough but skeptical clinical assessment to more summary judgments depending on the pressure the facility was under. But this category of case is distinct from the triage question involving genuinely wounded prisoners and genuinely wounded civilians. It adds complexity to the picture without changing the fundamental dynamic. Let's look now at how the geography of the campaign shaped medical practice. Because France was not one uniform theater, it was a series of distinct operational environments, each of which created different conditions for field hospitals and different versions of the civilian prisoner triage question. Normandy in the summer of 1944 was the most intense and concentrated phase. The bocage, the dense hedgerow country of the Norman interior, created a slow, grinding battle in which American forces paid enormous costs to advance relatively short distances. The civilian population of Normandy was caught in this grinder. Villages were fought over for days. Artillery and air support caused massive civilian casualties. French civilians who survived the immediate fighting often found themselves between the lines, unable to move, unable to access food or water, dependent on whoever arrived first to render aid. American medical units in Normandy were operating under the highest possible operational stress. Casualty rates among American forces were severe. The evacuation system was strained. And yet, the evidence from this period suggests that civilian treatment was not abandoned. It was compressed and expedited, but it was not abandoned. The political logic from Shyseff was present from the first day, and it shaped behavior even when resources were at their most stretched. The breakout in late July and early August of 1944 changed the character of the campaign dramatically. Operation Cobra cracked the German line, and suddenly American forces were moving fast. Very fast. The pursuit phase that followed sent American armored columns racing across France at speeds that outran their own logistics, let alone their medical support. In this phase, the civilian triage question took a different form. American forces were moving through towns and villages that had been held by the Germans for 4 years. The population was often in extreme need, but the moving front meant that field hospitals were being set up and torn down almost daily, and the opportunity for sustained civilian care was limited. In these situations, the typical practice was to provide immediate emergency treatment and then coordinate with French civil authorities, local Red Cross organizations, or whatever French medical infrastructure still existed to arrange follow-on care. American medical units became briefly and in many cases the first point of contact for medical need that had been building for years. They could not address all of it, but they addressed what they could before moving on. The siege of French cities created yet another version of the problem. Paris, liberated in late August 1944, presented an entirely different situation from the hedgerow fighting of Normandy. The French hospital system in Paris, while damaged and depleted, still existed. The Parisian civilian population was in better contact with what remained of French civil institutions. American medical units operating around Paris could coordinate with French hospitals in ways that were simply not possible in a Normandy village where the only medical resource for 20 kilometers was an American aid station. In Paris and other larger urban areas, the civilian triage question was partially answered by the gradual re-establishment of French civil medicine. American forces contributed supplies, personnel, and technical support, but the treatment of French civilians increasingly moved back into French hands as the liberated areas stabilized. The field hospital triage question was most acute in the forward areas, where the liberation was still happening and the French civilian infrastructure had not yet reasserted itself. The autumn and winter of 1944 brought new conditions. The pursuit had stalled. German resistance had stiffened along the West Wall. American forces were facing a prolonged campaign under increasingly harsh conditions. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945 created new mass casualty situations that stressed the medical system to its limits and beyond. In this phase, the civilian component of the medical workload shifted. The fighting was moving into territory that was either already liberated or moving toward German soil itself. The French civilian population in the deepest combat areas was smaller and more dispersed. The prisoner of war population was large and sometimes overwhelming. In the Bulge and its aftermath, German prisoners arrived in numbers that challenged the processing system badly. Medical officers dealing with thousands of prisoners at a time faced resource allocation problems that made the Normandy summer look manageable by comparison. In this environment, the informal triage hierarchy was harder to maintain, not because the principle had changed, but because the scale of prisoner medical need was now enormous, and the civilian medical need, while still present, was somewhat less acute in some areas. But even in this phase, the fundamental orientation of American military medicine held. American wounded first, civilians who would otherwise receive no care, then prisoners who were in the system and would eventually receive adequate care through the prisoner of war infrastructure. This was not always achievable, it was not always achieved, but it was the framework within which decisions were made. Let's now address something that has not come up yet, but that is essential to a complete understanding of this story. That is the role of American nurses in the field hospitals, and the way in which they experienced and shaped the civilian triage question. American Army nurses served in France from the early stages of the campaign onward. They served under fire, under conditions that the pre-war Army Nurse Corps had not been designed for. They worked in field hospitals that were sometimes within artillery range of the front. They worked in conditions of cold, mud, exhaustion, and constant moral pressure that tested everything they had brought with them from training. And they treated French civilians. They treated them with the same professional commitment they brought to American soldiers. In many cases, they treated them with a particular intensity of engagement because the civilians, unlike the soldiers, were often unable to understand or communicate with the medical personnel around them in the way soldiers could. A French child who was terrified, in pain, and unable to speak English required a different kind of nursing presence than an American soldier who at least understood the institutional framework he was inside. American nurses, by many accounts, rose to that difference. Their experience of the German prisoner question was also distinctive. Nursing wounded enemies was not new in the history of military medicine, but it was one thing to treat enemy wounded in a hospital safely behind the lines. It was another to treat them in a forward field hospital while the battle was still happening, while American and French casualties were still arriving, while the prisoner himself might have been responsible for some of those casualties. Nurses dealt with this moral reality in ways that varied by individual. Some described it as simply a professional obligation that they fulfilled without particular emotion. Others described it as genuinely difficult, requiring a conscious decision to treat the person in front of them, rather than the enemy combatant they had been fighting hours before. All of them, in the accounts that have survived, fulfilled the obligation. But the testimony of the nurses makes clear that it was not always easy, and it makes clear that the civilian triage priority was, from their perspective, not just a medical or strategic calculation, but a human one. The French people were who they had come to help. Helping them was the point. There is one more dimension of this story that deserves careful treatment. That is the question of how this practice was reconciled, by the medical officers who implemented it, with their understanding of international law and their professional ethics. American military physicians in World War II were not legal scholars. Most of them had completed their medical education, done their residency, and then been commissioned as Army officers without extensive training in the laws of war. But they were not naive about the legal and ethical framework they operated in. They knew about the Geneva Convention. They had been briefed on their obligations to prisoners of war. They understood that treating German prisoners as a lower priority than French civilians was at least in tension with the letter of the convention, even if not with its spirit. The way they navigated this tension varied. Some simply did not think of it in legal terms at all. They thought in operational terms. The civilian needed care now. The prisoner could wait. End of analysis. Others were more reflective and articulated a specific interpretation of the convention that they found convincing. The convention guaranteed quality of care, not sequence of care. And in a mass casualty situation with limited resources, the sequence of care was properly determined by medical and operational necessity, not by the status of the patient. This interpretation is not unreasonable. It is also not without complexity. Still others acknowledged the tension directly and resolved it in favor of the civilians on explicitly moral grounds. Their reasoning was, in essence, that the French people had suffered enough and that the American presence in France carried a moral obligation that the technical language of international law had not captured. This reasoning was not legally rigorous, but it reflected a moral seriousness that the most formally correct interpretation of the convention might have obscured. What no one did, as far as the historical record reveals, was make a principled argument that German prisoners were entitled to lower quality care, or that they deserved to suffer, or that their status as enemies justified neglect. The American military medical system, whatever its improvisations and informal hierarchies, maintained a fundamental commitment to treating the wounded as patients, not as enemies. The prioritization of French civilians was a resource allocation decision made under pressure. It was not a decision to abandon the laws of war. It is worth pausing here to consider something that the historical record makes quietly clear. The informal rules that developed in American field hospitals in France were, in their own way, ahead of their time. The 1949 Geneva Conventions, which superseded the 1929 Convention and were developed specifically in response to the experience of World War II, gave much greater attention to the protection of civilians in armed conflict. The Fourth Geneva Convention, adopted in 1949, established for the first time a comprehensive international legal framework for the protection of civilian populations in war. It was, in many respects, a codification of lessons learned from the war that had just ended. The practice that American medical officers had developed informally in France, treating civilian casualties as a medical and humanitarian obligation with specific operational significance, was part of the experience that fed into those post-war legal developments, not directly, not through any formal channel where you can trace a specific decision to a specific outcome, but the lived experience of medicine in a total war that involved civilian populations in ways the previous legal framework had not adequately anticipated, contributed to the post-war recognition that something needed to change. The 1949 conventions did not explicitly address the specific question of civilian versus prisoner of war triage priority in mass casualty situations. That question remains, even now, not fully resolved in international humanitarian law. What the conventions established was the basic principle that civilian populations were entitled to protection and humanitarian assistance, which is the conceptual foundation from which any answer to the triage question would have to proceed. Let's now pull back and think about what this story tells us, in the broadest sense, about how armies actually make decisions. There is a version of military history that focuses on the formal framework, the treaties, the orders, the official doctrine. It is important, and it is real. But it is not the complete picture. Alongside the formal framework, there is always an informal one, made up of operational necessity, political reality, individual judgment, and moral instinct. In many cases, the informal framework is more determinative of what actually happens than the formal one. The story of American field hospitals in France is a case study in this dynamic. The formal framework, the Geneva Convention, the Army medical doctrine, the SHAEF command structure shaped the context in which decisions were made. But the specific decision to prioritize French civilians over German prisoners in triage situations was made outside that formal framework. It emerged from the ground up, from individual medical officers facing impossible situations with limited resources and no explicit guidance. And it was reinforced from the top down, not through formal orders, but through the political logic of the liberation mission that permeated the command climate of the theater. The result was a practice that was consistent enough to be called policy without ever being formally designated as one. It was humanitarian and strategic at the same time. It honored obligations that the law had not yet formally recognized, while navigating tensions with obligations that the law had formally established. It was imperfect and improvised, and, in the assessment of almost everyone who experienced it, the right thing to do. There is also something in this story about the relationship between military medicine and civilian society that deserves attention. Military medicine in the United States had always operated within a particular institutional context. It existed to serve the military mission. It was funded, organized, and doctrinally developed for the purpose of keeping soldiers healthy and returning wounded soldiers to duty. The civilian population was not its primary patient population and had never been designed to be. But the reality of fighting through a friendly civilian population in a total war changed what military medicine had to be. The experience in France, and before it in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and after it in Germany and the Pacific, demonstrated that military medicine could not operate in isolation from the civilian world it moved through. The two were entangled. And the medical system had to develop the capacity to address that entanglement even when the formal framework had not caught up. The American military drew lessons from this experience. Post-war medical planning incorporated civilian emergency response in ways that pre-war planning had not. The concept of military assistance to civilian authorities in medical emergencies, which would become an important part of American military doctrine in the second half of the 20th century, has roots in the improvised civilian care of World War II. Now, let's talk about something specific that tends to get overlooked in the general narrative of liberation, and that speaks directly to the practical complexity of what American field hospitals faced. That is the question of children. French children were a constant presence in the civilian medical stream that flowed through American field hospitals. The occupation had left French children in poor health. Malnutrition was common. Preventable diseases had gone untreated for years. And the fighting of 1944 added acute trauma casualties on top of that chronic medical need. American medical personnel consistently described their treatment of French children as among the most emotionally significant experiences of their service. The children were, in a way that adult patients were sometimes not, the most vivid embodiment of what the occupation had cost France. A French child who was malnourished and frightened and bleeding from a shrapnel wound was, for many American medical personnel, the single most compelling argument for why they were there. There are accounts of American surgeons working through the night on French children while fully understanding that their primary obligation was to the military patients who were their official responsibility. There are accounts of nurses spending hours with French children who were terrified and alone, using gesture and tone and physical presence to provide comfort across a language barrier that could not be bridged by words. There are accounts of medical personnel reaching into their own rations, their own supplies, their own personal resources to provide for French children who had been brought to them with nothing. None of this was in any treaty. None of it was in any standing order. It was the moral response of human beings to human need, but it happened within a framework that had made space for it, a framework created by the convergence of political necessity, humanitarian obligation, and individual moral judgment that is the real story of American field hospitals in France. There is a final piece of this story that should be told, and it connects the experience in France to the longer arc of military medical history. The question of who gets treated first, and on what grounds, is one of the oldest questions in military medicine. It predates the Geneva Convention. It predates the modern concept of triage. It goes back to the earliest organized armies in recorded history, and it has never been fully resolved by any formal legal or doctrinal framework, because the answer always depends on circumstances that no framework can fully anticipate. What World War II, and specifically the experience in France, added to the history of that question was the civilian variable. For most of military medical history, the question was essentially about how to allocate resources among different categories of military casualties, the severely wounded versus the lightly wounded, officers versus enlisted, one nationality versus another in coalition warfare. The presence of a large, needy civilian population that was neither enemy combatant nor allied soldier was a new element in the equation at scale. Small-scale versions of it had existed in previous conflicts, but the sheer magnitude of the liberation campaign in France made it unavoidable. The answer that American military medicine gave to that new element was not perfect. It was not codified. It was not fully consistent. But it was, in retrospect, a meaningful step in the evolution of how military forces think about their relationship to the civilians they fight among. And it happened not because of a treaty, not because of an order from Washington, 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 not because That is a story worth knowing, because it tells you something true about how the people who were actually there thought about what they were doing and why. It tells you that the liberation of France was not just a military operation, it was a moral undertaking. And the field hospitals that were scattered across the French countryside, treating civilians before prisoners and American soldiers before both, were, in their imperfect, improvised way, living out that moral undertaking in real time. The treaties did not require it. The orders did not specify it. The doctrine had not anticipated it, but it happened, and the France that emerged from the war, with its relationship to the United States fundamentally shaped by the experience of liberation, was partly the product of the decisions made in those tents and those makeshift surgical suites by physicians and nurses who were making up the rules as they